In Chapter 2 of They Left No Crime Uncommitted, the author describes the inhumane conditions of his confinement in Bibb County Jail. It is nothing new. In fact, the jailed defendants charged in the January 6 protest and invasion of the U.S. Capitol are treated in the same manner. In a letter circulating on Twitter, Nathan DeGrave detailed the conditions of his confinement. I quote, "The harsh, unlivable conditions of our unit has caused health hazards that defy Department of Health regulations. And on at least 5 occasions, raw sewage has overflowed our unit, causing human waste to flood the floors and rooms. That's also in addition to the mold on cell walls, as well as the rusty pipes and dirty water that flows from these sinks. White rags turn brown when exposed to the water from our faucets." Close quote. It was Fyodor Dostoevsky who wrote that, "The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." I think it is clear what our society has become.
Chapter 2. Bibb County Jail, Macon, Georgia. After Judge Hicks bound me over for trial, the U.S. Marshals also bound me, with chains, as if I were a grizzly bear. I was dragged back to Bibb County Jail and shuffled to a cell block with other prisoners. Like the city of Macon itself, the Bibb County Jail is a gloomy, filthy, and utterly depressing place. Most overhead lights had been shattered, and all but 2 of the wide vertical plexiglass windows had been broken by prisoners and replaced with solid steel plates. It looked exactly like a dungeon. Many cells had standing water, and toilets that didn't flush. All had cockroaches, bedbugs, wharf rats, and 2-legged animals. The cells were one-man rooms with steel bar doors that opened and closed electronically. Because the overhead speakers didn't work, the jailers would signal you when it was time for chow by repeatedly opening and slamming the doors. You had a generous 5 seconds to get out or you would be locked in and miss chow. Occasionally a slow inmate would get his arm or head trapped in the door. The sadistic jailers thought it was humorous. I quickly discovered, however, that it was far preferable to have your head smashed and trapped than to eat what they called food. Aside from the thick vomitous odor that always pervaded the so-called dining room, you also had the appetizing task of brushing the cockroaches off the table before chowing down. Sometimes they were even cooked in the food. But at least those weren't moving. One of the 2-legged animals on my cell block was an obese slug appropriately nicknamed Gator. He was too fat to fit in a jumpsuit, so they scrounged up orange pants with an elastic waistband. Even these were so tight he had split the seams in front and half-mooned everyone in back. His privates were exposed and dangling when he waddled to my table. Disgusted, I picked up my tray to dump it and leave. "Are you going to eat that?" he asked, pointing to a large blob of gravy-covered fat in my tray. I told him no, but I spat it out after realizing it was fat. Quick as lightning, Gator reached for it and gulped it down like, well, a starving gator. I had to return to the sweltering cell block and its horrific odor of unflushed toilets, and now dead rats. But what I thought was dead rats turned out to be the feet and shoes of a man next door. Peeking in, I saw voodoo writings on the walls and a spider web of unraveled threads from his sheets that crisscrossed the walls and ceilings. Drugs had deep-fried his brains long ago. I placed a towel over my nose to filter the stench as I lay back in my bunk to contemplate my plight. There was no air conditioning or ventilation, so we had to roll our jumpsuits down to the waist and roll up the legs to survive the stifling heat. I sweated day and night, and when I awoke in the mornings my pillow was soaking wet. What little sleep I did get was disturbed by baby cockroaches crawling over me. There were hundreds in my cell. I also had constant nightmares of being chased by the police and of being shot at for no reason. I would awaken with violent muscle tremors and had to massage my legs to stop the spasms. I became claustrophobic and had panic attacks. The stress, the sleeplessness, and the inedible food caused alternate bouts of constipation and diarrhea. In just 5 weeks I lost 25 pounds and my hair began falling out. And, as if I weren't miserable enough, an older black man in an upper cell block began singing, "Come by here my lord, come by here, someone's hurtin' lord, come by here." Nobody came of course. Except Gator. Every night I could hear him grunting and whacking off 7 cells away. Another animal was never let out of his cell because his drug use had completely cooked his brains to the point he couldn't speak. Sometimes he would mumble at you when you walked by his cell, which was all the warning you would get before he pissed on you through the bars. Other times he'd simply empty his bladder on the floor of his cell, then strip naked and lay in it. My life had become a living nightmare. I fantasized that I was in a coma from a car accident and was merely dreaming all this. I wondered if hell could be any worse. The only thing that kept me from going off the deep end was a friendly guy named Cliff, a former fugitive who had been featured on the TV show, America's Most Wanted. He was one of the original cocaine cowboys and had avoided arrest for more than 10 years by living off $5 million in cash, which he carried in his car at all times. Cliff was now in jail with me and facing 20 to life. His story was that he'd quit flying cocaine into the United States after the feds began using satellites and surveillance aircraft to track planes. Unfortunately, his associates continued to smuggle drugs, and when they were caught they fingered Cliff as a co-conspirator to get their time cut. Fortuitously, the prosecutor liked Cliff and the many stories of his exploits. So to help him, he charged Cliff with only a fraction of the drugs he actually smuggled. He also promised to seek only a 5-year sentence for him. In return, Cliff agreed to identify a South American airstrip used to smuggle drugs into the United States. But as I later learned, Cliff was sentenced to 9 years in prison instead of 5. It seems the DEA flew all the way down to that airstrip only to discover a dense jungle. During my first 2 months at Bibb County Jail, I had lots of questions, and Cliff patiently explained how the injustice system worked and why I should plan for the worst. Most days he would buy me a Coke and a Snickers bar while we passed time playing casino. These simple acts of kindness were the beginning of my realization that most federal prisoners have more compassion and humanity than all the prosecutors, judges, and politicians combined. Before he left for prison, Cliff said he would help me if he could, but he did not have any money left. He had spent his entire $5 million drug smuggling profits to evade capture. This included paying his chauffeur $5,000 weekly to cover the risk of assisting a fugitive. The last thing Cliff said to me when he left was that he was anxious to go to prison. "Anything is better than this hellhole," he said. His equally friendly replacement soon ambled into Cliff's cell on crutches. He had used one of the crutches to whack a man in the head and was arrested for aggravated assault. With his graying ponytail, fist-flattened nose, rough visage, and criminal background as a former member of the Dixie Mafia, Bobby Barfield and his girlfriend Donna King became unlikely allies in my battle with the government. Things were surely looking up now.